President-elect Barack Obama officially introduced his national security team at a news conference in Chicago yesterday in announcing his choices of Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton to be Secretary of State, Defense Secretary Robert Gates to continue in office, and retired Marine General James Jones to serve as National Security Advisor. Obama selected the core group of people who will be in charge of foreign policy decisions in his administration. Obama praised their qualifications and records of service in government and civilian life.
In their past service and plans for the future, these men and women represent all of those elements of American power and the very best of the American example. They've served in uniform and as diplomats. They've worked as legislators, law enforcement officials, and executives. They share my pragmatism about the use of power and my sense of purpose about America's role as a leader in the world.
After Obama's introduction, each cabinet nominee gave brief remarks. The first was Senator Hillary Clinton. If confirmed as Secretary of State, she would be the nation's top diplomat in the Obama administration.
By electing Barack Obama our next president, the American people have demanded not just a new direction at home, but a new effort to renew America's standing in the world as a force for positive change. We know our security, our values, and our interests cannot be protected and advanced by force alone, nor, indeed, by Americans alone. We must pursue vigorous diplomacy using all the tools we can muster to build a future with more partners and fewer adversaries, more opportunities and fewer dangers for all who seek freedom, peace, and prosperity.
Obama asked that Robert Gates remain as Secretary of Defense, a post he has held since late 2006, when he was tapped by President Bush to replace Donald Rumsfeld. Prior to that, Gates served as director of the CIA under President George H.W. Bush. Questions have swirled around his involvement in the Iran-Contra scandal and his role in the U.S. government's arming of Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. At yesterday's news conference, he thanked Obama for his offer to continue as Defense Secretary.
I am deeply honored that the President-elect has asked me to continue as Secretary of Defense. Mindful that we are engaged in two wars and face other serious challenges at home and around the world, and with a profound sense of personal responsibility to and for our men and women in uniform and their families, I must do my duty as they do theirs. How could I do otherwise?
President-elect Obama introduced retired Marine General James Jones as his national security advisor. Jones is the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. He now sits on the board of Chevron and is president and chief executive of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Institute for 21st Century Energy. The institute's been criticized by environmental groups for, among other things, calling for the immediate expansion of domestic oil and gas production and issuing reports that challenging the use of the Clean Air Act to combat global warming. Jones thanked Obama for selecting him as his national security advisor.
As has been previously mentioned, national security in the 21st century comprises a portfolio which includes all elements of our national power and influence, working in coordination and harmony towards the desired goal of keeping our nation safe, helping to make our world a better place, and providing opportunity to live in peace and security for the generations to follow. I'm deeply humbled, deeply appreciative of this great opportunity.
Among his other cabinet selections, Obama also named Susan Rice as his ambassador to the United Nations. Rice served as a senior foreign policy aide to Obama during his campaign. Under the Clinton administration, Rice worked for the National Security Council and the State Department. At yesterday's news conference, she outlined some of the challenges that lay ahead.
With your election, Mr. President-elect, the American people have signaled to the world that our nation is on the path to change. Now we must fulfill that promise by joining with others to meet the challenges and seize the opportunities of the 21st century, to prevent conflict, to promote peace, combat terrorism, prevent the spread and use of nuclear weapons, tackle climate change, end genocide, fight poverty and disease.
For more on Obama's national security team, we're joined by two guests in Washington, D.C. Robert Dreyfuss is investigative reporter and contributing editor at The Nation magazine. His blog, The Dreyfuss Report's available at nation.com. Steven Clemons is a senior fellow with the New America Foundation, where he directs the American Strategy Program. He runs the popular blog, thewashingtonnote.com. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Steve Clemons, let's begin with you, your assessment of the national security team, starting with Hillary Clinton, Robert Gates and James Jones.
Well, it's certainly a fascinating trio, and when you take all of them together, it has created some grief on some parts of the liberal political establishment that was saying, hey, wait, didn't we elect Barack Obama, not a Clintonized version of him? I've encouraged people to take a step back, because one of my concerns during the campaign was that frequently, as my friend Bob Dreyfuss pointed out, Obama kind of carved out a McCain-light position on Pakistan, on the role and future of the Pentagon. He actually wanted to increase the size of the military force, et cetera. And I think that we are going to see a lot of Pentagon-hugging strategies from this group. What's interesting, though, it's not a status quo preserving group. I think if you were to imagine some of the big, I'll say a sort of Nixon goes to China moments that this country needs, particularly with Iran, with countries like Cuba, delivering on Syria and getting it on a Libya-like track, this team seems to me more able to do that kind of thing than many other assemblies. And so while I know that Hillary Clinton during the campaign was very much an advocate of coercive diplomacy, something that I thought she talked too little about carrots and too much about sticks, I do think that she's got to rewire herself and have a makeover, essentially, and will, in much the way Obama has. Obama is not the same guy who ran during the election. We're seeing a very different Obama today. And I think to some degree we're going to see a different Hillary Clinton. Just in quick conclusion, the problem with this team is it's very, very big guns. If Barack Obama takes his eye off the ball for a moment, if he's not engaged with these people for a moment, if he allows any distance to grow between himself and what he issues as national security policy and these big changes he wants to achieve, then I think we're going to end up with a paralyzed national security team. So I think in many ways it's a brilliant move, but it's hugely risky.
Robert Dreyfuss, your assessment.
Well, I agree with many of the things that Steve said, but I think it's important to point out that the people who aren't named, the people who weren't picked by Obama, were the people who weren't on the stage yesterday with the president-elect. There was nobody there from the anti-war wing of the Democratic Party. There were none of the liberal senators or even people like Jim Webb who spoke out against the war. John Kerry and Al Gore weren't there. Bill Richardson wasn't there. You didn't find, I mean, so you can go down a long list of people who he didn't choose. Instead, he chose what the Wall Street Journal and many other publications are calling a war cabinet. And the problem is, in order to fulfill his central campaign promise, which is to get our troops out of Iraq, he's going to have to do some, I think, direct hand-to-hand combat with people like Robert Gates and General Petraeus, who has political ambitions of his own, Admiral Mullen at the Joint Chiefs and elsewhere, who are going to be urging him to slow down, to take a step back, to relax, to, not mess up the surge that Gates has spent the last 2 years overseeing. So I think he'll be under a lot of pressure from the national security team that he himself is creating to slow down his withdrawal from Iraq, and he certainly left the door open for that. More generally, he pledged during the campaign to escalate the war in Afghanistan, which I think the rest of his team is fully in support of. Certainly, Robert Gates and Petraeus have endorsed the notion of adding another 20,000 or 25,000 troops to that failed war, which I think is another catastrophically bad decision. And he may find himself turning what had been Bush's failed war in Afghanistan into his own failed war, especially if he carries it over across the border into Afghanistan. So I think that the problem here is that the Obama that tilted to the right during the election campaign, supposedly to protect himself against Republican criticism, in fact, turns out to be the real Obama. And when he says change comes from me, we're seeing the kind of change that he believes in appointing a centrist pro-military cabinet. So that means, in effect, that it's change, yes, in that they're not neoconservatives. Certainly they're not going to look like John Bolton and Paul Wolfowitz and Dougie Feith in power. But it's going to look very much like the national security establishment of the Cold War and the post-Cold War 90s.
We're going to break, then come back to this discussion. Our guests are Robert Dreyfuss with The Nation. He's author of Devil's Game, How the United States Helped Unleash Fundamentalist Islam. His blog's at nation.com. We're also talking to Steve Clemons, Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.